We're continuing now with looking at some things by Jean-Paul Sartre, and beginning with his kind of autobiographical series of novels concerning some people and events just about the beginning of the Second World War. Later on we'll look at an earlier novel which gives a more kind of systematic overview of his philosophical ideas, but it's probably better to get these other ones out of the way first, because it's a bit more messy. But at the end of the last episode, I ended by saying that I thought I'd made a significant digression by talking about Graham Greene and one of the aspects of his novels, but now I think that probably wasn't such a serious digression as I thought, because something similar happens in one of the main characters in these Sartre novels. So what I was saying before was that I'd actually written a chapter in another book about Graham Greene, and I called that chapter A Great Idea for a Novel. And the idea that I was trying to get across then was that I thought Graham Greene exploited a certain dilemma in the lives of some of his characters, and possibly in his own life, and used that to be able to create fiction and also perhaps to produce some favourable outcomes in his own life. So the point was that a lot of the characters in some Graham novels are older men who end up getting involved in romantic relationships with younger women, and then there are difficulties arising from that because there's adultery for one thing, and probably crimes of other sorts. But that then creates a very strong plot line, in that there's all this inner conflict and outer conflict, and possibly crime, possibly other things, but particularly this idea that there's this transcendental notion that he's contrasting, and there's a conflict between his love as he sees it for this other young woman and his love for God as he sees it. And that allows him to develop these themes and create more novels out of them. And in the same way, the character, and possibly Greene himself, enjoyed the fact that he was able to have the excitement of this affair and this relationship, but at the same time consider that he is somehow has a higher level of sensibility, and that at the same time he's struggling with this aspect of his religious faith. So I guess what I was saying was that it seemed as though there was something self-serving in all that there was an element perhaps of self-pity, but also of self-congratulation, in that he was able to use this to create more books, and also to perhaps regard himself as being living on a kind of a higher plane of existence from the common humanity. Perhaps that's a bit unfair, but that's how it seemed anyway. But the point is that in these Sartre novels, the main character in that is a fellow called Mathieu Delarue, and he has a very similar experience in a way. So he has a lot of women friends, as you find out through the novels, but in the last novel, Iron in the Soul, at one point he meets a woman in the street and has a brief affair with her, and he says to her at one stage, "I have no one, there is no one that I love, there is nothing in my life." And it seems to echo some of the Graham Greene characters, or maybe Graham Greene's own expression. It just seemed a bit silly, really, in a way. But anyway, so these books, The Age of Reason, The Reprieve, and Iron in the Soul, as we mentioned, deal with events just before the Second World War and early in the Second World War. The main character we mentioned is a professor of philosophy, so I think one could assume that he is largely a representation of Jean-Paul Sartre himself. His name, as we mentioned, is Mathieu Delarue. In the first of the books, he's actually been involved in a relationship with a woman. He's getting a bit tired of her. She's now become pregnant, and he's trying to find some way that he can procure an abortion for her, but he hasn't got the money. So the problem that he has is trying to find enough money to be able to get an abortion for this woman so that he won't have to feel responsibility for her anymore, and because he wants to get rid of the relationship anyway. And that's kind of the main theme of the book, of that particular book. And in the end, he solves the problem by marrying her off to another character who's actually a homosexual. So we'll come to him in a minute. But the main, as we said, Delarue is a professional philosopher. The idea that he's trying to express in all of those novels is ultimately one must be free at all costs. Whatever one does, one has to be free. And that kind of really calls to mind, like, there's a John Lennon song, I think we've probably all heard, in which John Lennon apparently was imagining himself dead in a grave and his friends coming together to celebrate his life and death in some way. And one of the lines of the song says, "One thing I can tell you is you've got to be free." So freedom means, I suppose, doing what one wants. That also calls to mind the notorious Aleister Crowley, the famous magician and conjurer and someone who summoned up spirits and so on. And his basic philosophy of life was, what is it? The law. All the law is summed up in this: do what you want, do what thou wilt, just do whatever you want. And he was actually quoting, I think, the 17th century French Franciscan monk Rabelais, who said the same thing. So I think Crowley was directly quoting him. So Rabelais was this debauched Franciscan monk that lived a horrible lifestyle, totally far removed from the founder of his order, Francis of Assisi, whose way of living and thinking was far, far from that. So the Franciscan order seemed to have come a long way in those few hundred years since Francis's life. And but Rabelais' thinking seemed to have persisted into after the French Revolution and into the 20th century. And even if we recall what we were talking about a few weeks ago when we were looking at Camus, and particularly his book The Rebel, and he was dealing with this existential crisis as he saw it, and he thought, in the early part of the book he was talking about some of the ways that people had tried to cope with that, and he quoted the Marquis de Sade as one person whose solution to this problem of this existential dilemma of the human race was to live in total freedom, and one could achieve that by just living totally according to one's own pleasure, no matter how much distress that might cause to other people. So from Rabelais and Marquis de Sade we came to Jean-Paul Sartre and Aleister Crowley and John Lennon. So do what you want, be free. So then the debauchery of Rabelais, then we come to this other character in these Sartre novels, the one I mentioned, who Delarue managed just to get rid of his woman problem by getting her to marry this other guy who's called Daniel. And he is a homosexual, and not just a homosexual, but actually what you would call a pederast, I suppose, whose main ambition is to corrupt boys and young men. And in all of that, it seems that I think this is probably true of a lot of people in that situation, the desire is it's partly sexual, a kind of a sexuality, but the aim is rather than the sexuality itself, is the desire to actually damage and corrupt and spoil something that is innocent, and that's what he wants to do all the time and does do. Anyway, there are lots of other characters in the set of novels. We're not going to have time to even introduce them in this episode today, but just going on with Daniel, the homosexual pederast, De La Rue is friendly with him, accepts his lifestyle, he's very tolerant of all that, actually exploits him in solving his problem with this woman he wants to get rid of. But then there's a very dramatic episode that happens in the last of the novels, Iron in the Soul, where Daniel, the pederast, suddenly has this sense that he is being seen by God, that God is looking. He's never believed in God, he believes, but suddenly God is looking directly into his heart. And it's a searing experience, but also for him a wonderful experience, that God knows me, God sees everything about me, all the bad things, all the good things, and he still is there with me all the time. I'm not going to escape from him, but I don't want to escape from him. And he tries to explain it. He writes all this down in a letter which he sends to Matthew, explaining all the things that are happening to him at some length and in detail about the nature of this experience that he's undergoing. It's worth reading the passage. So Matthew gets this letter from Daniel, reads it, part of it. He reads it part of the way through. He's read about 2/3 of it. And then he just screws the letter up and throws it out of the window of a train. He just can't tolerate hearing any more of it. So I wonder what Sartre actually thinks about all that. Has he heard someone say something like that? Anyway, we'll go into a lot more about these other characters in the next episode.